Um, I mean, you said it, but is there anything else you'd say? You can talk about what the glue would be.
Well, I think the challenge, I mentioned to Phil earlier that for me, 15 years ago, I thought the glue ought to be not grant making, but civic engagement, that we ought to think about ways to involve family in kind of spin-offs or rollouts of things that we were going to do anyway. So we want to see something roll out. If there's a way to have family roll it out, okay. And then those people that are engaged in something that we value and roll out and are successful, that they become kind of the candidates for board service rather than the familially determined which branch they're on and who likes to have dinner with whom, which is often the way boards get passed on.
Very interesting.
But that's just
This is the 200. Yeah.
a challenge to Phil and to those moving forward. So the timber and one interesting aspect of John Andrus the First's life is that he had this chemical company that Mark has told you about. That was basically a predecessor of what is a sort of a competitor of Pepto-Bismol, in its time. And but John liked.
Sorry, we've got another.
Okay. If a son of John Andrus had wanted to take the business and had worked it through the Depression, it could well be a family business the way others carried through. Ours didn't.
I think the sound is improved.
Okay. So you were starting to tell the whole timber story as an example.
Yeah. So John Andrus, he was he managed this pharmaceutical company that Mark Devenoge, I think, has told you about. He was known to be a very controlling manager. He was not good at developing a second line of managers to deepen and broaden the business. And so the business did not survive the Depression. But he loved hard assets. He loved land. He loved timber. And he was, in the late 1800s, this was a time of the explosion of the West. And he was intrigued with making investments in and looking at opportunities in the explosion of the West. And so he took advantage. There were opportunities to accumulate land that were just rampant. The government was U.S. government was trying to get people to move out west, so they were trying to get school teachers and nurses and doctors. So to buy land out in California. So there.
It's just
Yeah.
started up again.
Okay.
Tentatively, we're clear.
Tentatively.
California.
Yeah. So there were programs the U.S. government had in place to try and populate the West Coast. And so John Andrus and others took advantage of those programs to assemble names of people and by their intention to go out. Some would say they just fabricated the list of names. Others, they actually, but they ended up, John Andrus teamed up with good operators. So the good operator was a guy named T.B. Walker from Minnesota, and he was a big-time Minnesota timber guy. And Andrus was the money guy and partner. and they accumulated a million acres of California timberland, and developed together a company called Red River Lumber, and at one point had the largest pine sawmill in the world in a town called Westwood, California, that was basically a company town to mill all of this. And they managed, consistent with the pattern of the time, which was, had nothing to do with sustainable forestry. Land was a discard. They would clear the land, they'd bring, and they would, give the land away or sell it for $1 an acre. It was a total discard. So a lot of the money that John made came from the clear cutting of this timberland. It carried forward to the point in the 1980 when we still, Surdna and the Andrus family, still had 240,000 acres of timberland. It had been sequestered between Surdna and Andrus, so we had different pieces. There was a family committee that John Andrus put together to oversee what was known as the Andrus Forest, and then I oversaw what was known as the Surdna Forest. And it followed roughly the same percentages, the 45% and the 55%, within the trusts of Surdna ownership and family ownership. And we had an environmental program here at Surdna during those years, and since we were cutting trees, we became the leading developer of what is now known as the sustainable forestry practice in California. And Surdna grants through Hooper Brooks and our environmental program, we probably put $15 million in developing that. Time came to sell for basically two reasons. We started managing the Surdna forest using sustainable practice. And sustainable practice, as you might expect, means a little less in current return than if you used the most economically, financially driven one that would just clear cut the way John Andrus had initially. And there were members of the family that resisted that wanted to maximize their current return. So, we felt that conflict. And then there's a specific rule for foundations that they can't hold an operating entity for more than 15 years or so without selling it. It's just under IRS foundation rules. So we needed to sell ours. So we decided, the two groups got together to sell all of the timber. I was working on the Surdna side with people who might be buyers, who would continue to do sustainable practice, because it was our view that who we sold to was as important as everything we'd done to build the field. Because if we just sold the land to the guy that was going to clear cut, we wouldn't have been supporting the field. And long story short, the black hat in the industry, a guy by the name of Red Emerson of Sierra Pacific, came in and said at the very end of the day, because I'd spent a year working out with land trusts in California and calculating how much of a haircut we could take, and what it was really worth if you were doing sustainable forestry. And the black hat came in and offered 20% over what any one of us had thought of, and but on the requirement that he get it all. And so I was distressed, because I thought, here's a family foundation, a family that's educated themselves in a field, understands the difference between maximizing value and doing it in a sustainable practice, and that we ought to stick with the letter, that this would be a wonderful story for a family foundation to say we had done it this way. But it didn't work out that way. And the money ruled. And so it was a sad day for me personally, because I thought, as I said, this was this would have been a great story for the Andrus family and the Surdna Foundation going forward. On the other asset that I'll just shift, the other asset John Andrus bought was land in New Mexico. New Mexico is interesting in that you've got Native American folks that have lived generations in New Mexico, and then the Spanish took it over, and the King of Spain gave land grants to Spanish surname people, and then our cavalry came in the 1860s or whenever, and with U.S. laws set by Washington, and suddenly, there was a new ownership. And there was a fellow by the name of Catron that basically, many would say through chicanery, accumulated 2 million acres of northern New Mexico land. By basically, the Hispanics would say they stole it from us, but there were a lot of American courts that were using American law that would not, would just pay no recognition to, a Spanish land grant. So John Andrus in about 1890, with Sam Thorpe, the first, so the Sam Thorpe that you might have met in an earlier interview, his grandfather. And just an aside of a story about John Andrus the first, he would find a business partner and then introduce the business partner to one of his daughters, and so that's how that little connection by family story came about. And they bought about 250,000 acres from Catron. And they were going to build railroads, they were going to build reservoirs, they were going to develop towns. They were just, because that's what was happening in the West. You could get this land. The California land was this program run by the U.S. government. The New Mexico was land, was the chicanery with taking it from the Hispanics and buying it from Catron. They held it for about 20 years, and then decided, John and Sam Thorpe, and then decided not to develop it, but they sequestered the mineral rights from the land, which you can do. You can sell the fee title, the ownership of the land, and hold the right to mine it, separate. And those mineral rights continued as an investment, as an family investment in the trust that I was trustee of, right through until about 7 or 8 years ago. And so I was trustee of the trust and realized that if it had come out of the trust and into the family, we had mineral rights on 250,000 acres of land, that the same factors that I told you about on the timber would come to play. And a lot of the land was owned by Indians. The Jicarilla Indians had 90,000, their reservation. And so I spent 5 years, and here I didn't have to work with other family. I was trustee with a bank, and all I had to do was convince the bank to do it, which I did. And felt that rather than selling to a mineral company, a mining company, because Surdna had programs that were trying to limit mining in sensitive environmental areas, which this was one. And so we set about a 5-year program of selling back to the fee owners who didn't even know they didn't own the mineral rights. And so there were probably 500 transactions. Some big ones like to the Indian tribes, but some smaller ones, and we had to demonstrate that in fact we did have the right, and in fact had the right not only to mine but to buy their land back at $10 an acre, which was part of the original agreement. So I felt that was the right solution for a philanthropic family to just put that back. So that happened. And there were kind of echoes of, Fred, you didn't get maximum value for that. But as I was telling Phil, I think, that's the challenge of all of our time moving forward, is how do we give up, how do we move off the maximum consumption, maximum economic gain option that we see to come into something that is sustainable. And that's, that's all of our challenge, is how we do that. So part of that fell to me in terms of my involvement with Andrus and Surdna. Well, I was proud, even though it was a distressing, going back to the timber, I was proud of having stood up for these principles. And, even though people did not want to talk about it after, there's no question that the lesson was received. And so I was proud of that. I was proud of the mineral rights. I was proud of the visioning the progression of a foundation to the point that I'm saying of where it has to, there has to be a new program or philosophy of involvement. And to have it based on competence and interest rather than who you know or who you like. Proud of this idea, since we're now 5th and 6th generation, of just simply articulating there will come a time when it's good to let it go. When you have 64 great grandparents, and no longer is the money creating this lightning bolt through, that says this is the way we define family, to acknowledge that, and it's going to be painful because there's attachment to this family. But my mother and Edie's mother and John and Steve, the 3rd generation, they all knew their grandfather. My generation, none of us knew John Andrus the First. We knew our grandparents and parents, and they certainly carried this vision. But my children, the 5th generation and the 6th generation, those are distant stories. They might want to hear the story, but it has no passion. It's not really part of who you are and how you grew up and all. And so just the awareness of how unusual it is for an organization to last into the 5th and 6th generations, and the challenge it affords, and that different ways of involvement may need to be thought of, and with a different composition possibly of the board, and managing without. I'm sure family are not ready to let it go as a family foundation, but the form of participation and the form of ways that people might be connected, and to let it be more drawn by affinity and involvement and talent rather than family branch and who you know and who you like to have dinner with. That would be my.
You were saying about the specifics of just the experience of not having the memory of, I think you were talking about knowing your grandparents and then knowing them,
Yeah.
but your children not knowing their great-grandparents and how that
Yeah.
affects their involvement.
Yeah, and because the you know the family really ends with the second generation. You know, the third generation carried it and they had but it was those grandparents of mine, you know, that were his children that really that had the firsthand. My mother's stories of her grandfather are about handing out quarters or silver dollars or, you know, just little anecdotes. But it was John and my mother and Steve and Betty Hawkins and that generation that really, you know, knew those stories. So as time goes on, it just is that okay. So you know, my mother was on the board of all the homes, all of the entities I was, and then as we broke down the entities and wanted to spread board opportunities among people, we started minimizing. We tried to come to a balance of having some overlap just so there was good communication, but to have independent people serve on one board or another. So my daughter Beth Sjogren is now on the board of the AOH. My sister Carol is on the board of AOH, and my niece Stephanie Cardon is on the board of the Andrus Family Fund. So those are a couple examples of family who are related to me in my branch and how they are engaged now.
So
Well, you don't go to a family foundation meeting in 1985 or 90 and not encounter the question of non-family members on the board. And all the best foundations suggested it would be good to have non-family members on the board. There is a cordiality and a civility and a desire not to embarrass a family member that gets in the way of good process and good grant making. Sometimes you have to disagree, and you disagree in a civil way, and but it's good to disagree. And many family feel their membership offers an entitlement that just an outside director would not feel. You know, a good director is there to be helpful, to be part of the process, but doesn't feel entitled to get his or her way. Family members often feel entitled, and that can be quite a constraint. Non-family members tend to get stuck in repetitive cycles of old stories. You know, we've always done it this way, or John told me that this is the way he wanted it done, if John's voice or the memory of John's voice happens to suit that person's argument in the moment. And often those get in the way. And non-family members come without the family dynamic of, you know, we've always done it this way, without those stories, without knowing what John might have said 20 years ago. And often, if chosen well, have a particular expertise and certainly a particular awareness of what good board practice is and what good process is. You know, you might try within family selection to have people that are experienced with boards, but often it's their very first experience with a board. But with non-family, if you have accomplished people, they've served on, small nonprofits, large corporate boards, they really have that perspective. So there's a kind of leveling, and just by bringing them in, when we did, and I was an early adopter, early encourager. It was 3 years, and before anybody took it seriously, people thought, they'd be limited in doing what they wanted to do. They wanted to tell those whole stories. They wanted to do it that way, and having an outsider, would just stop that short. So when we brought the 3 on in our first wave, we hired a search consultant. And we went through the same process that you'd go through if you were hiring a president for when we hired Phil. And what is their background? And you just look and you use the search person who's experienced at looking at resumes and knowing what, and coming up with a job description and matching the job description. So those are formal procedures that often when you're selecting a family member, you don't do. Even if you do them on paper, it all kind of evaporates because of some familial issue. And our experience when they did that 3, we had a wonderful set of 3 that came on the first. And then when Tom Castro, who came on, I guess he was the 4th, the process in the room changed significantly for the better. So it's just a very, very good thing to do. And so I don't know what the foundation's current practice is, but I hope it continues. And sort of related with my point over time is that it may be that the board chair ought to be a non-family member. Right now, the current board chair is not a blood family member, so that for many becomes a kind of Maginot line to cross. Initially it's just blood, and then in-laws or outlaws, depending on how you want to choose to call them. That becomes we've already crossed the line of selecting based on competence and ability to lead, and ability to work with the president in a collaborative way that is focused on policy and process. And often a non-family member might serve very well in that, who understands that it is a family foundation and there are these, David Grant's name was mentioned, and he would have been an example of a person that would have been a great chair of the Surdna Foundation, because he understood what the family's trying to do, and part of his job is to encourage good behavior. Well, it was very thorough. We hired a headhunter that we knew very well, who's very good at doing what he does. Some of the length, I can't remember the specifics of why it took as long, but it may have been because that guy is busy, and all of our searches with him took a little longer than, because he did all the work himself. Some headhunting firms, as you probably know, they've got lots of people that do field interviews and all, but this guy did all of his own work. He wrote the most incredible meeting notes. You'd get, fascinating to read because he was just so bright and insightful. And, he could publish them in the New Yorker as a profile or something. They're just very, very good. But, I measure the time from, when we first said this would be a useful thing. And there were half of the board just said no initially. We don't need that, and we don't want that. So it was probably a 8-year process to go from the initial no's to doing it.
That's what I was wondering, because if there was some sort of backlash at all.
No, I mean, once we crossed the bridge and then once people met these people, I mean, there were wonderful, wonderful people that we brought on the board. One of them was a champion of our current president, who had worked with Phil in another setting. So there were just wonderful, wonderful overlaps and insights. Well, I think all of the, as I say, grant making is a conversation about values first, looking at the world and, figuring, where the needs are, strategies, looking at outcomes, looking at where you can make a difference. I mean, we could all think of dreamy things, I think the Gates Foundation has thought of some dreamy things that maybe were too dreamy, and you say, could we really make an impact? Could we really do that? So there are a whole series of analytic steps that the mind goes through when you're thinking about trying to fashion a program. And so there's a skill set. So if somebody has worked for Time Warner, and really thought about, what is the future of technology in the world, and and what is this company's position, and how do I do it? That's invaluable relative to somebody that's just been a really great mom and just doing a terrific job raising her kids. And, I mean, it's so, and if you get, so it's not only sort of the general skills, but then you can relate them specifically to foundations. And somebody that has seen another.
Hold that thought.
So somebody that has specific experience with foundations. Because a lot of foundation work, it's not only that same process of going from abstract down through strategy, but it's if you know what others have done and are doing. So you're not, replicating each other and can introduce to partners. That was one of the things that Ed, worked very hard at initially, was finding good collaborative partners, and I'm sure that Phil has continued. You don't want to just be a silo unto yourself. You want to test yourself. You want to learn from others' successes and their failures. You want to defend against the natural hubris that comes with giving money. Because, you can't go to your grantees and say, did we make a mistake giving you that $300,000? No, they're going to say, you are so smart. That was just the best thing you ever did 2 years ago, was to give me that money. So there's that sort of natural, you have to protect yourself as a grant maker from that. And outside board people can help you do that, because they're just outside your particular sphere, outside your silo, and so they can bring so much. Well, I've been an educator, worked a lot with young people, and so the thought that young people could be encouraged to engage in public discourse and be involved at an early age and kind of set that was important. I have been a semi-practicing Buddhist much of my adult life, and so aspects of mindfulness and awareness and emotional literacy are keen, aspects of my life. And so one of the early aspects of the effective citizenry had to do with emotional literacy. Because often there are, so many pressures that all of us feel, an ability to be discriminating in an intimate, personal way, and to differentiate feelings from thoughts and ideas and pressures. Those are all a skill set that often, if young people can learn those and then apply them. I've been involved with college programs of community and undergraduate programs of community service, and often they're very perfunctory. There'll be some office on the back 40 of a campus, and some guy that really isn't, or gal that really isn't related to the campus life will have arrangements with a soup kitchen or something and send people out to do stuff. And we had this idea that we wanted to promote it where it was more central to the teaching function of the institution, where it had the support of the president or head if it was a school, and where faculty, where you could have some of those outreaches be part of history, economics, social studies, whatever, and where there was a feedback loop of reflection. So it wasn't just going out and doing it, but where you came back and you had to share your reflections on it. And so those were a couple of the starting points, and then we wanted to move the whole field forward because it was a kind of scattered field. Those people on college campuses often were silos on their own campuses. And so we had conferences where we brought all those people together, where they were able to share best practice and what they did. We hired a researcher to come in to basically articulate the process and to write about it and publish about it. So it was a field building exercise, which is, what was one of the characteristics of what we did. We'd enter a field and didn't want to just make grants, but we wanted to have some lasting output, a paper or something that could be shared that would support the whole field. So that was one. And over time, I think it just proved maybe too thin a program. It had we made some great grants, but I think it, we were always struggling to kind of add pieces to it that fit within that rubric of effective citizenry, of just encouraging young people to engage in a meaningful way. We had a number of radio and television people, young people that were recording their own voices in positive and creative ways and linking with low-power FM radio stations and the things. But I think we had difficulty over time kind of holding it together. Often the board, it was sort of I was sort of the godfather of it, so felt, comfortable with it, but often some of my fellow board members, would, at the end of dinner would say, what's that program about? What are we doing there? Others were a little clearer and more intentional. Sure. Yeah, this sort of relates going back to the investment process, one of the key decisions a foundation needs to make is whether it's going to be a perpetual institution or not. Many, as I said, with so many family foundations decide they're just going to spend down. You know, particularly if the donor is alive and the founding donor and just says, you know, I want to experience this within my lifetime. I want all the benefit. And there are many public entities that encourage that too. You know, there are voices out there that say foundations should not live in perpetuity. They should be encouraged to spend down, and new wealth, new technology companies, you know, they'll form theirs and spend down, and you know, we don't want this bevy. A lot of those voices that argue that way are on the right side of the spectrum, because I think it's fair to say that most of the foundations of longevity tend to be progressive on the left side of the political spectrum, and some of those other people don't like that they're sort of institutional entities that carry those interests, so they'd like to see them go away. But one way financially, if you are going to be a sustainable organization financially, there's a whole set of arithmetic and mathematical calculations that relate to the returns that you can expect from your investments, from your endowment, what the rate of inflation is, and then what you can routinely spend each year, such that the purchasing power in 20 years, you'll be able to do the same work, not in nominal absolute dollars, but in purchasing power dollars. You can do the same thing in the future. And that's what we set to do. It's, you know, it's a fairly elaborate calculation that Mark Devanoge is expert in doing. And it is an issue that during my time, I became, and then I worked for Cambridge Associates. I became a consultant for Cambridge and did it for the Hewlett Foundation and Stanford some, and so I worked with others. But I began to view my role in that, wearing that hat, as the voice of the endowment. You know, the voice of the endowment that says, you know, I want 3 generations from now to have the same opportunity that we now have. So we have to maintain this discipline. If we don't, you know, they won't have that same opportunity. There are lots of voices for the imperative of a social need and why you should spend more. And it was another constant conversation that I was having with Ed Skloot, because he always had, you know, his view was the imperative of what we're doing now requires that we spend 10%, not 5%. You know, it's too important. You know, he's just too impassioned with it. And, you know, I admire that. That's terrific that somebody has that passion. But if somebody is the voice of the endowment and says, if we want to be a perpetual institution, and, you know, that was always our idea as a family foundation, to be a perpetual institution. And even if we broke from being a family foundation, you know, the board could still say, we want to be a perpetual institution. We want this to continue. You must, you know, work within that very simple arithmetic formula that looks at total return, you know, capital growth plus income, inflation, and then what you spend, so that the corpus can grow. Because a foundation, there's some foundations, you know, that might be receiving new money, and where people can give, and so then it becomes a question, you know, do you account how do you account for the new money? You know, do you want the fund that was given last year to have the same purchasing power, or do you just want the entity as a whole accounting for new money? But Surdna is not getting any new money. You know, the corpus is set. So, and they're board members that, you know, we're always, how about 5.5? Oh, how about 6? How about, you know, is that really? And in the short run, it's not going to make much difference. But the leading example of a university, of a case of somebody that overspent was Wesleyan University in the 70s during a high inflationary time. And they spent their endowment at the rate of about 10% as during high inflationary times. And I'm not sure they're caught up now. And you know, another way of expressing the same idea is that you can simulate, do models, arithmetic models of simulation based on total return, and you can spend 7% now or 5%. And those lines will cross in like 8 years. And you'll say, in 8 years, you know, the 7% and the 5%, because the 5% you've been accruing and growing, and they'll go like that. And that's, you know, kind of the most persuasive argument, that if you spend at 7%, you know, and you feel that imperative to do it, it's a very short-lived advantage relative to. So that was an awareness and an argument that I had to go through that exercise every year, didn't I, Mark?
Yes, every budget cycle.
Yeah, that's true. Since going back to the trusts and that they were going 55% to family and 45% to the foundation, and that the trustees were family members, they weren't going to get the benefit of accumulation, you know, so they had a bias toward high income. You know, we were not distributing total return. The bank was just giving current income. So they wanted fairly high bond ratios that were going to generate more yield. So when I got into Trust 3, the voices that they had been listening to, the bank had been listening to, were some of the people that wanted, that knew that their life was not likely to outlive the end of the trust, and they were arguing for high bond percentage and current yield. And so I took this very argument that I'm talking about that there's a related aspect of the spending is how you allocate bonds and stocks. If you have a higher percentage of stocks, you know, you'll have more accumulation, and in the long run, you'll be much better off. So I shifted. They had a 50% in, it was actually 45% in bonds when I was initially the trustee, and then shifted it to 70. And during some good market periods, the trust accumulated a lot of value during that time. So I feel good about that. So the amount that the foundation has received and that family have received is much higher now than it would have been if we'd stayed at the lower allocation. No, I don't. No, I'm more interested. That's why I met with Mark last night and Phil this morning. I'm more interested in just trying to be helpful to the team here in terms of, because I know you're kind of, as Phil explained it, you know, you're working with, individual pieces, and then you say, well, what do we have? What's the story? And I know I've known filmmakers, and sort of say, well, gosh, I mean, here's a story, and I didn't know this at the beginning, but so maybe we need to have a couple more people come in, and that is a nice little piece, or have John or Sam or somebody come back and amplify. So.
Right.
Well, no. I mean, you're right. It has been a huge part of my life. It has been a huge part of my life.
Okay.
Can I get you a sandwich, friend?
Yeah, sandwich. I'd love a sandwich.